So my name is Zachary Sarah Corleissen. This is my legal name, and it's awesome. I am non-binary. Specifically, I am bigender. And this is my first time using my full non-binary name in a professional presentation. It is so nice to finally meet you. I work for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, part of the Linux Foundation, and I work mostly on Kubernetes docs. I'm one of the co-chairs for the Kubernetes Documentation Special Interest Group. We shorten that to SIG-Docs. So if I say SIG-Docs, I'm talking specifically about Kubernetes documentation. My co-chairs are Jennifer Rondeau, who is here, and Jim Angel, who is not. And today I will be talking about what SIG-Docs has learned from a year of localizing open source documentation. This is my Twitter, Zach or Sarah. If you want to respond, clap back or clap along. These abbreviations appear in this talk. The Kubernetes abbreviation is pronounced KATES, like Kate's docs. For the sake of time, I'm not going to define localization or its relation to the larger system of internationalization and translation. If this is your first time hearing these terms, for now, just think of localization as a better form of translation. I've spoken before about different aspects of Kate's Docs localization. Last year at Write the Docs Cincinnati, I presented with Jared Bati about our community decision-making process and how that led us to choose localization. At FOSDEM earlier this year, I spoke about the technical details of the Kubernetes.io website stack and about mistakes that we made along the way in figuring out how to do localization. The link to the FOSDEM video is on this slide. I recommend that video because the bit with the mistakes is really valuable. There may be useful information here for documentarians in private enterprise, but this talk is specific to the experience and practice of localization in open source documentation. Localization opens technology to a wider audience, and I think it's important to talk about why this matters. It's because it opens doors, it reduces barriers to entry. Localization is a tool to drive adoption, and adoption drives shifts in power in open source projects. The more contributors that come from local areas that have localized content, the more people can contribute and drive feature development in an open source project. So it reduces barriers to entry and it drives shifts in power. Localization is a powerful tool for powerful change. And if you take one thing away from this talk, please let it be that creating the capacity for localization in your docs is worth it. After more than a year of open source localization, I can say that the most difficult parts were figuring out everything at the start. The investigation, the problem solving, all of the mistakes that we made, to figure out whether this kind of localization in open source docs was even possible. That work is done and you get the benefit. So my hope is that you can use this talk to start your own localization framework in your own open source docs. Please come to me next year and tell me how wrong I was that it was a difficult thing. I would love to hear that. It's my absolute measure of success. So when we first considered localizing the Kubernetes docs in early 2018, we, meaning the SIG chairs, had no experience with localization, and consequently we had very limited expectations of what folks could or should contribute to localization. And that's how we thought of localization contributors. We thought of them as somehow a distinct category from regular contributors. And I don't think that any of us could have defined what a regular contributor was in our mind. We just had this distinction that regular contributors were somehow a thing and localization contributors were somehow different. And we were wrong. At first, we expected that folks would contribute just their own localized content. They would maybe contribute upstream to English if they felt like it, and we were lucky. But we also had a vague fear that localization contributors might break things. And again, we would be hard-pressed to define what breaking things meant. It created a false binary of fear and safety that was pathologically tied to success and failure. And we would have been hard-pressed to define what success or failure meant. So there were all these nebulous feelings and poorly grounded perceptions. And thankfully, very early on, we learned that our fears were unfounded, that we were wrong in the most wonderful ways. Localization teams contribute so much more than language, and they are equal stakeholders in documentation as a whole. There are no separate categories of contributors. It's just all of us working together. Localizations don't just add localized content. Chris, would it be possible to switch to the handheld? Sorry, this thing is falling off my gigantic melon of a skull. Is this working okay? All right, excellent, thank you. So localizations don't just add localized content. Most teams contribute upstream to English content on a regular basis. When something is difficult to translate, localizers improve the English source, and they make it easy for other teams to translate as well. Many teams contribute to localizations other than their own. For example, the French team are experts at helping other localization projects bootstrap. They are very, very good at helping other projects get started, and they reach out proactively to offer that help. The French, Spanish, and Portuguese teams collaborate on etymology and Romance language. For example, they collaborate on the etymology of gendered pods, or gendered nouns for Kubernetes components, like le pod. Teams have improved the localization process for all contributors. Not only do they improve English upstream content, they make it easier for other teams to localize. The Korean team's branching and milestone strategy is a best practice that we recommend for every localization and that we've adopted for English source. And they contributed that model to us. Korean contributors also created a script that determines when an upstream source has changed between versions and needs to be relocalized. And they designed this script specifically so that any localization could use it. And that's a very powerful contribution. Localization exemplifies the best of open source contribution. Rather than working solely in their own language projects, contributors increase the quality and resilience of documentation overall. And wonderfully, contributors also work across cultural and political barriers. For example, Chinese, Japanese, and Korean localization teams collaborate with each other. And I don't want to brag or grossly oversimplify global and regional politics, but open source localization succeeds at collaboration where other historical efforts have sometimes fallen short. Open source localization provides opportunities for mutual benefit that, whether it's because of the tight scope of the work or because of the transcendent nature of the work, or both, allows contributors to transcend boundaries that would otherwise inhibit collaboration. So I've talked about qualitative improvements brought by localization, but there are some quantitative aspects to consider as well. Originally, this presentation had a lot more analytics slides, but the screenshot text is tiny, and ultimately you just have to trust me anyway. So I removed them, and trust me, it'll work fine. So these analytics represent site traffic over 6 months between March 1st and August 31st of this year. And what this particular screen shows is that localizations constitute between 1% to 2% of site traffic Chinese is one exception. Chinese content gets about 7% of site traffic. That may not appear like a big increase in page views, but if you consider the additive effect of each localization, with each localization correlating to a 1 to 2% increase in site traffic, currently that results in a total increase of 15 to 20% increase in page views. Kubernetes.io gets between 1.25 to 1.3 million page views per week. So 15 to 20% additional site traffic is a meaningful increase. And if we look at other analytics, if we look at the effects of localization, not as a percentage, but in terms of absolute numbers of users, the effects are still remarkable. And I want to highlight the statistics, how this plays out with Korean localization. On this slide, you can see that there's 55,187 visits to Korean content over that 6-month period. So as a side note, one of the reasons why we're all here, the business case for why documentation exists, the reason people pay us money to do this is to provide what I call one-to-many support. Docs make it possible for a few people to support many people. So that's one-to-many support. It's a one-to-many support relationship. Currently, there are 8 people dedicated to localizing content in Korean. And over 6 months, the ratio for contributors to readers is 8 contributors for 55,187 people. And that breaks down to about 1 to 6,900. So while Korean site traffic may constitute only 1.6% of weekly site visits, I would argue that a 1 to 6,900 support ratio over 6 months is pretty effective. So it's worthwhile to consider not just as a percentage of site traffic, but as an absolute number. And this is where you have to trust me with analytics. When we look at other statistics like time on page, bounce rate, exit rate, these metrics are healthy for our site, and they indicate that readers are even more satisfied with local content than they are with English. People really like finding localized content, and when they find it, they stay around and read it. So this is the portion of the talk where I offer advice. When I spoke at FOSDEM, we had 3 localization projects, Chinese, Korean, and Japanese. Since then, we've added an additional 7 languages, and we've been approached about adding 2 more. So we have scaled up localizations quickly in a short time, and it's been successful. I am no more stressed by 10 localizations than I am by 3. And that means that we have a process that works. So I feel pretty confident about the advice I'm going to give. Leave the details of how folks create localized content to the discretion of individual teams. Different cultures have different team and leadership styles, and imposing a uniform process requirement on how a localization team works, that's antithetical to the purpose of localization. It's mutually exclusive with the goal or the outcome. It's a self-defeating strategy. So let teams determine how they work best. That said, we do require localization teams to adhere to the Kubernetes Code of Conduct, and the Code of Conduct is one of the first pieces of output that we require from teams that localize. Requiring that initial output of the Code of Conduct keeps localized content and teams aligned with community standards. There are some bottlenecks in localization, and they're difficult to solve and work through. Specifically, the bottlenecks that we encounter are infrastructure, permissions, and filtering by language. And these things require, each one of these, infrastructure, permissions, and filtering by language, they require solutions in order to be able to localize effectively at scale. I'll talk more specifically about each one of those pieces in a moment. Trust is essential to collaboration, and the way to develop trust is by making sure that boundaries are clear. Presume good intent on behalf of your contributors, but be very careful about assigning permissions for destructive actions in a repository. Partly that's basic InfoSec, but being careful with permissions serves not only to protect the repository, it protects the localization teams from well-meaning administrators. Confession time. All three of the current SIGDocs chairs have at some point force-pushed an empty branch upstream. In case that's not immediately clear, that is a highly destructive action. And as a side note, I'm mulling a talk proposal about how Git reflog saved my career. So, infrastructure. Choose a good site generator that has stronger native multilingual support. Hugo and Gatsby are both excellent choices for static site generators when it comes to localization. They're written in Go and React, respectively. Hugo offers native multilingual support, and Gatsby offers multilingual support with a well-supported JS plugin. Jekyll is a perfectly lovely platform in many ways, but localizing with Jekyll is extremely difficult, and I don't recommend trying. So, filtering for issues and pull requests by language. This is probably the single most important requirement for a localization project. It's also possibly the most difficult piece to automate, mostly because there aren't a lot of good options that I'm aware of for automating filtration by language. If there are good options that you know of, please shoot me a tweet and let me know what options there are. Depending on your version control software, if you use GitHub or GitLab, it's possible to create and add language labels manually, but I strongly recommend against doing so because it doesn't scale well if you have to manually add labels for every single language that you make and apply labels individually to every single issue and pull request. And that's important. Filtering by language reduces the cognitive burden required for review and approval, and it's critical for localization at scale. Two recommendations I can make for automating language labels. The first one I don't really recommend. I raise it for visibility. Prow is the Kubernetes CI plugin. Prow provides native filtering of language by path, but implementing Prow solely for language filtering is serious overkill. You could do it, but it's really not the best choice. One of our contributors, Zach Arnold, wrote a language labeler that works for Hugo sites. It's possible to adapt the logic to other site frameworks, but this is maybe the only easy to implement language labeler that I know of that it's possible to automate that kind of filtration with. It's also important to provide adequate permissions for teams to self-administer changes to localized content while limiting access to destructive actions. So some specific advice about review and approval. If possible, separate review and approval by company. That is to say, require review and approval from contributors at different companies. If a contributor from one company proposes a change, require approval from a reviewer at a different company. It keeps people accountable. It's a community accountability mechanism. And that leads us to some cautionary tales. Get reviews from native speakers, ideally before you publish. And know not only how to enable localized content, but how to disable it. One of our localizations was essentially a solo project. And sometime after we enabled it on the website, a developer who was a native speaker of that language contacted us to say that the localization was gibberish. It was laughably incorrect. And after some digging, we discovered that the content was a raw machine translation performed by a non-fluent speaker. So after disabling the localization in question, we updated our localization guidelines to explicitly state that machine translations are not sufficient as a minimum standard of quality. We also added a requirement that localizations be fully self-sustaining with a minimum of 2 contributors who possess advanced or native fluency in the relevant language. It's important to provide a means for your community to be able to verify the accuracy of localized content and get reviews from native speakers in your community if possible. Open source localization is not free labor. Compensation in open source is a large and ongoing ethical question. There are not any really easy answers, and this is equally true for localization. Make sure that in whatever localization model you set up for contribution, make sure that people are not being exploited. Even if you're not the team doing the exploiting, if you discover exploitation in one of your projects, I would argue that we have a responsibility to make sure that our content is ethically sourced and that it leaves people better off, not only as a result, but as a process. The Kubernetes contributor docs have a section of content for starting a new localization, and this is the URL for it here. Thanks.